Conversations are the venues where leaders do so much of their work. We all know someone who can always keep a conversation interesting and relevant. In this episode, how a key tactic can help you towards more meaningful conversations. This is Coaching for Leaders, episode 717.
Produced by Innovate Learning, maximizing human potential.
Greetings to you from Orange County, California. This is Coaching for Leaders, and I'm your host, Dave Stachowiak. Leaders aren't born, they're made. And this weekly show helps you discover leadership wisdom through insightful conversations. Oh, conversations, it is such a key word. It's such a key principle for us, and it's such a key activity, not only for leaders, but also for us as human beings. And so much of our success in our relationships is about conversations. And yet it is something that I think almost universally we're challenged by. How do we have the best conversations? And how can our conversations help us to make the world a better place? And I am so glad today to welcome a guest who's going to help us to get better at having more effective conversations and connecting well with people to build our relationships. I'm so pleased to introduce to you Alison Wood Brooks. She is the O'Brien Associate Professor of Business Administration and Hellman Faculty Fellow at the Harvard Business School, where she created and teaches a course called Talk. As a behavioral scientist, she is a leading expert on the science of conversation, and her research was referenced in 2 of the top 10 most viewed TED Talks and depicted in Pixar's Inside Out 2. She is the author of Talk, the Science of Conversation and the Art of Being Ourselves. Alison, hi, glad to have you.
Hi, Dave. Thank you so much for having me.
You point out in the book that being a successful person is about relationships. And of course, so much about relationships is about talking. And we all know that we're not so great at difficult conversations, but it turns out that we're not super great at the easy conversations either, are we?
No, that's right. So first of all, every relationship is a repeated sequence of time that we spend in conversation with someone and away from conversation with them. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind as our relationships unfold in our lives. When I was hired at Harvard, I was hired to teach a course called negotiation. And it's a course that we have at sort of every business school, every law school, a lot of graduate schools in all over the world. And I was teaching this course on negotiation, and I sort of had this epiphany that we don't just struggle with difficult conversations and negotiations. We struggle with the conversations we have all day long, every day, with all of the people in our lives, even the ones that on their surface seem easy and like they should be fun. We're constantly saying things that we regret and doing things that we regret and forgetting to talk about things that we should talk about. And what's going on there? Why are we stumbling through the social world in this way? And as a scientist, I was bound and determined to figure it out.
Yeah. And there is so much in this book, the model that you frame for us. And I was sharing with you offline before we started recording that already reading this book has gotten me thinking about different ways that I show up in all kinds of different conversations and relationships. And one of the things you write that really struck me is you say, though we can parse our words in many ways into phrases, sentences, paragraphs, turns, syllables, and so on, it's the topics that we as talkers choose, follow, manage, and remember. And as I've been thinking about this, I'm curious, what do you mean by topics in this context, and what's so significant about them?
Okay, awesome. So let's back up for 1 second. First of all, it's not a conversation until there are words involved, whether you're on the phone with somebody or on Zoom or face-to-face or texting or emailing. The words that we exchanged with each other make it a conversation. The definition of conversation is any exchange of words between 2 or more people. All right. So there's always words involved. Now, sometimes there might be nonverbal cues. Sometimes there might be acoustic. You can actually hear the words and sounds that they're making, but there are always words. And so when we start to think about the words that people exchange with each other, there's so many different sort of levels of analysis, so many ways to break it down. In conversation in particular, the turn level matters. That's something that's really definitional about dialogue, is that I take a turn speaking and I might say a bunch of sentences and then I stop. And then you take a turn and respond to what I've said, hopefully.
Yeah.
And we go back and forth, right? We do turn taking. So turns are important, sentences are important, words are important, but the human mind is not fast enough. It's not a supercomputer. It can't keep up with, if we were to try and monitor every word choice that we make, or even every sentence that we put together, we can't keep up and do that. We can't be sort of like monitoring everything that comes out of our mouth. So what occurred to us as psychologists is, what is the level of analysis that we could focus on that people can actually exert some control and agency over? And it turns out that topics are like the perfect level of analysis because they're useful. We can actually exert control over our choices when we're making these decisions about what topic to talk about, whether to call back to something we've already talked about, to drift to something else, to jump cut aggressively to something totally unrelated. And the topic level of conversation becomes very useful. You asked now, like, what is a topic? A topic is any thematically related chunk of turns in a conversation. And I think intuitively, we all know what a topic is. It's sort of, if I asked you, hey, Dave, like in your last conversation, could you just make a bulleted list of the 4 topics you covered,
right,
or all of the topics you covered? You would intuitively know what I mean, and you could do it pretty easily. And so when we look at when you look at transcripts of conversations, you can do that chunking task where you pull together all the thematically related things that people say into topics.
One of the things that you point out in your work, and I certainly have had this experience, and I think a lot of us have, where we all run into people in our lives, some of them we work with, some of them are family members, these people that just seem so great and instinctual about how to have wonderful conversations, and so adept at being able to engage people and be interesting and all the things like we want from a great conversation. And you point out that good conversation is, yes, about the instinctual parts, but it's also about deliberate effort. And one of the invitations is to do some thinking about topics in advance of a conversation. And that's something I think like most of us don't think to do in most contexts.
That's right. What you're describing is something in the book that we talk about called the myth of naturalness, where when we see really great conversationalists, people who seem so charismatic and smart and charming and engaging, it's easy to believe that it's effortless for them. And maybe it always has been, and they were born that way. When you start to study the psychology of conversation, you realize it is not effortless for anyone. And the people that you see doing a good job at it probably have been working hard at this skill for most of their life or for a time in their life. And in that moment during the conversation, they are still working hard at being a very engaged listener, at making all of these micro decisions to manage the conversation well. Conversational skills we are not born with them. They are developable and anybody can learn them. And what you're touching on is one of the skills that is so helpful to everyone, and that is topic prep. So thinking ahead just a little bit about the topics that you might raise during a conversation. Even for 30 seconds before a conversation starts, if you think, oh yeah, last time I talked to them, I knew that their kid was going to try out for the school play. And I think they mentioned that their dad had to have surgery and that they had this big presentation coming up at work. So I want to remember to check in about those things. And also, I saw this really cool show that reminded me, and I think they'd like it. So I'm going to mention that too. So you've now just come up with 4 great topics. And if you had not spent those, 15 seconds reflecting about it, you likely would have forgotten to bring them up during the conversation. Or even if you did remember, you're going to use a lot of cognitive effort, a lot of your mental load, a lot of your brain space to do that creative task while the conversation is unfolding. And it's just much more difficult to do that creative task, that memory task, during a conversation compared to before the conversation starts, when you're alone and at rest and you have more cognitive bandwidth to think about it.
It's so interesting, and it makes so much sense at an intellectual level. And yet I'm struck by you sharing so many stories in the book of how when you invite people to do this, do a little thinking in advance about topics, how many people push back on it and say, no, like this is not like the natural way of like how we have conversations. We just don't think to do this. And in fact, sometimes we actively work against it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my goodness. I was shocked by how many people are so averse to topic prep. And in diving into those feelings of aversion, it now makes a lot more sense to me. I think some people, it doesn't occur to them to prepare topics, to think ahead. They think of conversation as this task that should be spontaneous and sort of improvised, and they go through life winging it, which, okay, let's set that bucket of people aside for a moment. Then there's other people who are like, okay, I can imagine that you could prep topics before like a work meeting, like design an agenda, whatever, but I don't need to prep topics for conversations with people I know really well, like my spouse or my kids or my parents or my friends. Like, we're going to know what to talk about. We see each other all the time. I think about them a lot. I know what we're going to always know what to talk about. And so people are like, they're worried. They're worried that if you prep topics, it's going to make the conversation feel forced or rigid or wooden or somehow overly scripted, I suppose. When you actually nudge people, and I do this with both my students and in my research with participants, when you nudge them, when you sort of make them prepare topics and then have a conversation and compare it to people who have not prepared at all or thought ahead at all, you see that there's just all of these rewards awaiting people who have thought ahead, even for 30 seconds. And here are some of the rewards. One, you feel less anxious during the conversation because you have a sort of backup plan of what to talk about. Number two, you're more likely to land on topics that are mutually interesting. Like, yes, you should talk about their kids' audition for the school play because that matters to them. And if you care about them, it will matter to you too. And so thinking about that ahead of time means you're going to actually do that very important conversational task of landing on magical topics that are mutually interesting. The third thing is that it helps at the boundaries between topics. So topic boundaries. These are places where we can often feel awkward, like we're running out of stuff to say. We both kind of realize it. We have longer mutual pauses. We have more uncomfortable laughter because everybody's sort of wondering, should we move to a new topic? And if we do, what should it be? So you're doing this little creativity task on the spot. And we all know how that feels. It feels sort of panicky. You're like, yeah. I can't let the conversation die right now. And if you have thought ahead about possible topics, even as simple as, oh, I need to ask about their dad who had surgery, in that panicky moment, you don't feel panicked. And you just say, by the way, how was your dad's surgery? Like it's just ready. It's right there in your back pocket and you can bring it out whenever you need it. And I think what people underestimate, the people who feel very averse to this, what they underestimate is like, hey, if the right moment doesn't arise for you to raise those topics, you don't have to. It's fine. Yeah. It's just that they're there if you need them.
So this is fascinating on so many levels. And as you were saying that, I was thinking for years when I do interview prep, I have a section of my notes that is titled Reserve. And it is almost never do I go to it, but it is, I always have 3 or 4 things there of if we run out of stuff or if I hit that awkward point in an interview of like, I don't know where to go next, that I've got some backup plans for something. And yet never think to do that in my personal life or in conversations that are kind of like one-off conversations or individual conversations with clients or other stakeholders. And I think it's like, it's really interesting thinking about some of the examples from your research and in the book of the anecdotes of people who push back at this, like, I don't want to prep topics for all the reasons you just said. I don't want to sound scripted. It just doesn't seem natural. It's not like intuitive, all those things. And yet when you go ask those same people after having conversations, sometimes they'll cite the best conversations are the ones where someone else brought in a prepared topic, you know?
And what's so crazy, so in many of these conversations with my participants and with my students and just in life, what's so funny is sometimes the people who are very averse to topic prep are like, oh, and I had this great conversation. It was so spontaneous. We were so improvised, so smooth, so great. And then you ask their partner and their partner's like, oh yeah, well, I thought about that ahead of time, right? Like I thought about you when we were apart. I thought about what you'd want to talk about, what the point of this interaction was going to be, what you would like to talk about. And then I did it. And they're like, oh my God. Oh, because it's invisible, right? Of course, the people who are already prepping topics naturally, you don't get to see their prep unless they tell you in the conversation, hey, I was like daydreaming about you for hours and it occurred to me that I should ask you this. Like usually we don't say that. We just ask the question.
Yeah.
So that all of that topic prep work is invisible. It's part of this, going back to this myth of naturalness, right? Like you see great conversationalists and you can't see that all the work they did before the conversation began. It's mostly invisible. And so you think it's just coming to them off the cuff, and often it's not.
Well, I think you said something big a moment ago too, that even if you do the prep and you start to think about topics, you may not actually bring those topics into the conversation, but just the act of doing the prep and having some things you can go to oftentimes like brings more presence in the moment, and it's a more enjoyable conversation, even if you don't get to the topics. It's so fascinating.
And it's more than just presence, right? Like the having a lower cognitive load, more brain space to focus on your partner is crucial for being an actually good conversationalist. You need to listen. It's so effortful to listen to somebody else and think about them and focus on them relentlessly as a conversation unfolds, and try and coordinate all of the topics and things that you're saying and all your jokes and all your stories, whatever. That is so effortful that literally anything you can do to offload that cognitive work to before the conversation is going to be a huge win. And Dave, something you said a little bit ago reminded me, when you think about your day, like let's say you wake up in the morning and you think about your day, we all know with quite high precision who we're going to see in the day. Sometimes it's because we have like certain meetings scheduled or Zoom calls. Other times it's because it's people that we see most days, like your family members or a friend. But you also know with pretty good probability the archetypes of people that you're going to see. Like, you know, oh, I'm going to run into somebody, like there's going to be somebody working at Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks, and I'm going to interact with them at the cash register. So even if you've never met that person before, you know that there's going to be a person there. And you could think about, like, in that context, as I am checking out and getting my coffee, what one question could I ask them, or one joke could I make that would brighten their day? That is also topic prep, right? Like you're thinking about the archetype and thinking like, what would be a unique thing for someone to say that would make that interaction, even in our 15 seconds together, that could make it better.
And this is where the creativity and the thinking about this, I think, probably is a little scary for some of us, of like, okay, well, I get it. It makes sense. How do I get inspiration for topics and like what I might say in a conversation with a colleague, with the barista, with my spouse? When people kind of buy into this, but they're like, all right, where do I start? What do you find helps?
Oh my God, this is such a fun question, because inspiration comes from everywhere. I mean, the very easiest answer is, hey, in my book, there's a list of 100 topics, 100 questions you can ask people. Go there, start there if you'd like. That could be helpful. But the broader answer is, inspiration for our conversation topics is everywhere in the world. It's, in a way, I think, why we watch TV shows. It's why we read books. It's why we listen to podcasts. It's why we take an art class, or like try out an experimental drug. These are all experiences and pieces of learning that are potential topic seeds for our conversations with other people. So don't underestimate the power of saying like, hey, I saw this weird thing, or this funny thing, or I saw this weird reel on Instagram and it reminded me of you, or I wondered if you'd seen it too. Inspiration can come from everywhere. And it shouldn't be stressful to think about that. It should be sort of exciting, and thinking about, well, which of this like world of possibility would be most fun and productive to talk to about with specific people in your life.
When you were saying that a moment ago, it reminded me of one of the examples in the book of a gentleman who listens to the This American Life podcast. And the reason
Yes.
he listens isn't so much for his own listening, but he uses it as just a creativity ground for deciding what topics he would ask people in conversations. I think it's really fascinating to like have something that's a regular part of your day that you use to generate ideas.
Absolutely. And it's a very subtle mindset shift. Like most people are already listening to podcasts and watching TV shows and reading articles.
Yeah.
So you just shift your mindset and say, oh, I'm not just doing this for my own edification, for my own enjoyment, but also as potential topic seeds to talk about with other people. It might nudge you to sort of absorb that information slightly differently. You start asking yourself, like, well, who would find this most interesting? Or how can I frame this as a question when I talk to somebody? Or like, well, how could I retell this as a story? So Mike, the guy in the book that I talk about, and he listens to the podcast, This American Life, and he had so many examples. He listened to one episode where a guy and his friends, his kids had been exploring in the woods and they stumbled upon this abandoned house. And when they went into the house, it looked as if the family had left with no warning. Like there was still dinner on the table and there was like a prom dress hanging on the door.
Huh.
And so when he's listening to this story on This American Life, he finds this intriguing for his own development, but he's thinking like, what is the question I could ask people if I give them quick context about the story? And then he said, the question I ask people is, why do you think they left? Like, that's so fun, like so weird. And you can, of course, that's not going to be an appropriate thing to bring up all the time, but every once in a while it will be. He uses it when he goes to like work conferences and everybody's awkwardly standing around in a windowless ballroom, not knowing what to talk about. He's just like, oh, let me tell you about this podcast episode I listened to recently, right? Like it gives him fodder to make those conversations much more interesting.
One of the key points you make, and I think there's a big distinction here, is that having a good conversation isn't about choosing good topics. It's about making any topic good through topics management. Tell me about that distinction.
Oh, yes. This one, I'm obsessed. I continue to think about this. Most of us have the instinct, the intuition that good conversationalists are good at choosing topics, that there are just like the right questions to ask, the right things to talk about with certain people. And to some extent, that could be true, right? A little bit like you should choose topics that align with your goals. If you want to get advice from somebody or you think they need your advice, you should probably say, would you like my advice? Or you should say to them, do you have any advice for me? Right? So remembering to raise topics that align with the things you actually want to achieve, that's sort of the definition of choosing good topics. But when we look at how conversations unfold, you start to realize no matter what the topics are, there are some people who can take even the weirdest or most mundane starting point and they make it great. They make it fascinating. They make sure that it is in pursuit of the things that people are hoping to achieve. And they do it through all of the things that we talk about in the book, right? Asking questions, finding moments of levity, focusing relentlessly on your partner and really listening to them. And it's just that distinction between, yes, you should try and raise topics that are good, but also once you're in it, your whole job is to like make it even better.
Yeah, and there's very much there's a science, but there's also an art to this of like, it's not simply taking 30 seconds before the conversation, thinking about the 5 topics and following them in order when you get into a conversation.
Correct.
Like that's where it would be very scripted and bulleted, right? It's you've got those, you show up for the conversation and it's like a great jazz artist, right? Like they know the notes, they know all the music theory, they got all the pieces, and then in the moment they decide, all right, maybe I'm going to start with topic 3. And then based on how the other person responds and where this conversation goes, maybe we spend 20 minutes on that. And then I realize like, oh, something shifted and I'm going to go back to topic 1 that I was thinking about, or maybe something else entirely. Like that's a big part of the art of this.
Yes. I mean, Charlie Parker, the jazz saxophonist, has this fabulous quote that's like, as a good musician, you practice, 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 but then you get up on stage and you let it all go and you just wail. And I love that mentality because it's both. You should be doing as much as you can ahead of time to prepare and be ready. But then once you're in it, the key for improvisation is reading the room, reading your partner, and reading yourself. And just like you're saying, Dave, that reading the room, reading yourself, reading your partner, those are as much an art as they are a science.
Thinking about this from partially also the standpoint of managers and coming into conversations with employees. And so often we've talked on the podcast over the years of being able, especially like in a one-on-one conversation, of being able to ask Michael Bungay-Stanier's question, what's on your mind? And have the other person drive the conversation and set the agenda and be paying attention to them. And how do we support and serve them in the best possible way? And I think there's a both and here of like how we also could show up to help that conversation along by thinking about topics in advance. And I'm wondering if you've thought about this or seen this in the research on how do we both show up with some thoughts of like doing some prep, thinking about topics, and at the same time being able to meet people where they are, and sometimes throwing that out the window, but also sometimes utilizing that to actually help and support the other person. I don't know if I'm asking a clear question here, but
no,
that's
you are. And I think let me share a story that I think can help us answer this question.
Please.
There's an element of like, how are you both very prepared and very flexible? And I think in the context of conversation, the sort of question built into that is like, how do you both lead and follow, especially in terms of topic management as things go along? So in my class, at the very beginning of the semester, one of the first exercises my students do is called the chat circle. And it's sort of like speed dating, but without the romantic part. And each student has a 5-minute conversation with 5 other classmates over the course of this class session. And they rate how the conversation has gone after each one. And this is what we're practicing. They've all prepped topics ahead of time that they could talk about with anyone, right? So that's sort of the baseline. But during the conversation, they're aiming to meet their partner where they are and try to be flexible. And then afterwards, we can ask them questions like, well, how many of you actually raised some of the topics that you prepared ahead of time? And for those of you who did, how did it go? Was it better? Was it worse? And we measure all of these things. Now, one round of the chat circle exercise, I randomly assign one person in each pair to be the topic leader and the other one to be the follower. And then the following round, they flip roles. And so many delicious questions spill out of this experience for them. For the students who are sort of alpha and used to being controlling and used to being leaders, it is so hard when they are put in the role of a topic follower. It means that they need to relinquish conversational control to their partner and just go where that other person leads them. And for people who are possibly extroverted, loud, domineering, this is very, very, very hard. By the way, I am one of those people. And so it is a skill to be developed to be able to follow other people's lead in a conversation. And it's something we should actively work on. Vice versa, for students who are possibly more introverted or just more experienced and comfortable letting other people take the lead, being put in the topic leader role is really uncomfortable for them. They don't like it. It feels stressful. It feels like pressure. It feels like you're asking them to do something they don't want to do. And so there's all of these dynamics are playing out in our natural conversations as well. And we sort of trade off the roles of leader and follower. We all have available to us this power to control the flow of topics in a conversation, but we also have the power to relinquish control and follow where our partners want to lead us.
And part of what I'm hearing there is just being conscious of that like given the conversation, given the moment, I'm thinking about so often I hear managers say, well, I'd like to have the conversation where the employee comes to the conversation and it really is their topic. It's really like they bring the agenda, they show up with the things that are on there. I really want to focus on them. And they say all that, they set it up, they ask the person to bring the agenda, and then they show up in the conversation and they like don't have anything and they don't really know what to do. And I think what I'm hearing you say is like, hey, being ready for both of those moments. Like in theory, yes, someone would show up and have this beautiful agenda. We would be there as servant leaders to support them. And yet like the reality is that a bunch of times that just doesn't happen. Someone's not equipped to do that. They're scared, whatever. Right. And so having the reserve, right? The backup plan of like, okay, in the event someone shows up and they're not prepared, they're not ready, I've got 4 or 5 things that I can do in the service of this other person, in the kindness of supporting them, that I can leave some breadcrumbs that will help us to move through this conversation in a wonderful way.
And they can be breadcrumbs that are helping to unlock the other person, right? So you don't have to abandon the goal of having that employee still be the topic leader, but you might need to provide them with prompts that make them feel more comfortable or more inspired, right? And you really need to think carefully about that. What is it that you're hoping to unlock in them? Do you want to hear where they're feeling most anxious or most confused in their work? Are you hoping to unlock little points of pain for them? That your questions should focus on that so that you can get them to open up. If it didn't work as a starting point, it's sort of like a failure on both sides. The employee didn't do their topic prep, didn't do their due diligence, and was possibly like either underprepared or too scared to actually be the topic leader.
Yeah.
But on the other end of it, if you're usually the topic leader and you're like, I want to relinquish control, you have to sort of stick with that, even in the event that they need your help in doing it, right? Like, don't say, hey, I want you guys to sort of bring the topics to this meeting, then show up and continue to dominate the airtime and actually decide I'm going to just bring up stuff that I want to talk about, which we see happen often as well.
This work is so fascinating. We're only zeroing in on one of the 4 aspects of conversations. And I hope that if this has been helpful, you'll go get Alison's book and read it. And then, of course, go and utilize it and practice in conversations. And Alison, I often ask people what they've changed their minds on. And I'm curious, in doing all the research you've been doing, and especially putting this book together and now people engaging with these ideas, and especially around topics, what, if anything, have you changed your mind on as you've been doing this?
Sure. I have realized many things, but one that kind of is sticking with me these days is this idea of small talk. I didn't realize how profound and pervasive the dread of small talk is in the world until doing research on conversation and teaching my course. I've now realized that people not only dislike small talk, they actively dread the experience of feeling trapped in small talk. And I guess I just didn't realize it because I kind of like it. I view it as like a treasure hunt. It's a social ritual that you can't avoid. You have to start a conversation somewhere. And usually the most appropriate place to start is with easy topics to sort of reify your relationship with people, to greet strangers, whatever. So what I've realized and what I've changed my mind about is, okay, let's teach people to lean into small talk. You can't avoid it. And instead of thinking of avoiding small talk, think of it as an opportunity. It is a treasure hunt and you have to do it. And the mistake that most people make is that they linger in it too long. So instead of dreading it, view it as this opportunity, as a launching pad, and get out of it as quickly as you can.
Alison Wood Brooks is the author of Talk, The Science of Conversation and the Art of Being Ourselves. Alison, thank you so much for your time and for your work.
Dave, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
If this conversation was helpful to you, 3 related episodes I'd also recommend. The first 2, the related topic of difficult conversations. That is, of course, the work of leadership, of often starting, continuing, and leading the difficult conversations that come up. In episode 497, Kwame Christian and I talked about the way into difficult conversations, and we talked about the first few moments of a conversation. Often that is the hardest point of beginning the conversation, framing it, where you start, the initial steps. In episode 497, Kwame and I talked about, okay, how do you actually do that? Where do you start? What's the mindset that's helpful? And also then tactically, where do you begin? In a closely related episode, 655, we continued the conversation on how to help difficult conversations go better. Sheila Heen was my guest on that episode, and we talked about her iconic book with her colleagues at the Harvard Negotiation Project on difficult conversations. Difficult conversations I read, more than 20 years ago. It has informed so much of my thinking on conversations with others over the years, and Sheila was so gracious to teach us on how to help those difficult conversations to go better. Some of the key principles from Difficult Conversations, episode 655, super helpful for that. And then finally, I'd recommend the episode with Charles Duhigg, How to Connect with People Better. We talked about his recent book, Super Communicators, on episode 670. And in that conversation, one of the points he makes is helping us to nudge a little bit more toward emotion and a little bit less toward transaction in conversations, and more importantly, how to do that. So many of you told me that was such a helpful conversation. One of the most downloaded episodes we had last year. Great compliment to this conversation today. Again, that's episode 670. All of those conversations you can find on the coachingforleaders.com website. And there have been many episodes about conversations over the years because that is so important as a venue for leaders to do their work. And so you'll find that and many other topic areas inside of the free membership. We've made it as easy as possible for you to be able to find what you're looking for inside of the library. It's hard to do that on the apps, but it's easy to do that on the website. And the best thing to do is just go over to coachingforleaders.com, set up your free membership. You'll be off and running in just a few moments, and you'll have access to the entire library searchable by topic. So you can track down the episode you're looking for, also all of the notes and references from me, plus a ton more inside of the free membership. For access to everything, just go over to coachingforleaders.com. The conversations don't stop on the podcast, though. They continue in many other ways. And one thing I do every single month is invite a guest who has been on the podcast before to a more personal conversation with our members. And we spend an hour talking with them about their work, and oftentimes something that was featured on a past episode, but we talk about in the context of the real situations that our members are dealing with every single day. We call it an expert chat. It's an opportunity for our members to get together with the experts directly and have a conversation, and they ask the questions, not me. In our most recent one, my friend Tom Henschel from the Look and Sound of Leadership podcast joined us for a conversation on how to deal with a narcissist. Tom and I hit on that a little bit in a past episode, but we didn't have a chance to explore it fully. And in that recent conversation, Tom and I and several of our members had an in-depth conversation for an hour on how do you handle it when you run into that situation where all of a sudden you find yourself working for someone who's a narcissist, or maybe one of your peers is, or a direct report. How do you handle that and deal with it? The bad news is there's a whole bunch you can't do that doesn't work, that people try all the time, that actually make things worse. The good news, though, is once you know what that is and you make peace with that, there is so much more that you can do. And we had a detailed conversation about both of those areas. It's one of our recent expert chats. The recording is part of the Coaching for Leaders Plus membership. If you'd like to get access to that recording, plus all of the recordings of expert chats over the last 5 years, Coaching for Leaders Plus may be an avenue for you. For details on what's involved and what's a benefit inside of Coaching for Leaders Plus, just go over to coachingforleaders.plus for more. You'll get access to all of those past expert chats, plus new expert chats every single month, those recordings available to you, and a ton more inside of Coaching for Leaders Plus. Coaching for Leaders is edited by Andrew Kroger. Production support is provided by Sierra Priest. Next Monday, I'm glad to welcome Sandra Motz to the show. We are going to be talking about how leaders can use the algorithms for good. Important conversation right now. See you back next Monday, and thanks as always for the privilege to support you.